Perhaps we'll talk about the plane crash. Just got to remember about it though.
Welcome to Polar Podcasts, where you'll hear stories from geologists who've spent their careers, their lives, exploring and studying the remarkable and remote geology of Greenland. Why did they become fascinated with Greenland? What were the problems and the discoveries that drove them? And what was it like working in these remote places, where few people venture, even now? I'm Julie Hollis. In this episode, we hear from Kent Brooks, Emeritus Professor at the Geological Museum in Copenhagen, about a chance discovery while on a geological expedition to East Greenland in 1966, the implications of which followed him over 40 years.
The Oxford group was David Bell, Brian Atkins, two undergraduates, who I've lost touch with now, Richard Norris and David Parrish. Anyhow, the four of us, our idea was to go and visit the Lilwas intrusion, which is, 200 kilometres to the northeast of Skagerrak, and a very inaccessible place along the Blossville coast. And, it's an extremely inaccessible place. It had been discovered by Wager when he was sailing with Captain Einar Mikkelsen on the second Scoresby Sund expedition. They sailed down from Scoresby Sund to Ammassalik in order to look at the nature of the Blossville coast, or the coast between Scoresby Sund and Ammassalik, with a view to mapping it. And in the event that people would want to go between the two places, nobody ever did, in fact, but they built a series of huts along the coastline, so that if Greenlanders who wanted to sledge from one to the other could sledge from there along a line of huts. Anyhow, they came to Wiedemannsfjord, and Wager spotted these unusual-looking rocks inland, and he went with Captain Einar Mikkelsen onto the Kronborg Glacier in an attempt to go and see what these rocks were. He thought they were cyanides.
A cyanide is a fairly unusual sodium and potassium-rich magmatic rock.
And they weren't able to get across the Kronborg Glacier, so they never found out. And we thought this was a suitable sort of target. We could go and solve this problem. Being naive, still naive, even though we'd been to Greenland before and found out that things didn't work out as you were normally planned. Anyhow, we were dumped by the Norwegian ship there, and it didn't take us very long to find out that we couldn't get across the Kronborg Glacier either. It was a pretty horrific place, and we decided maybe we could outflank it by going inland. Well, this was when we found this crashed plane, which was to play a long part in my life. It carried on influencing me for the next 30 or 40 years. We were going up the glacier, and it was the sky was blue and the sun was shining, and you couldn't really see anything because we were blinded. And after we got up to the top of a rise on the glacier, and somebody turned around and said, "My God, there's a star on the side of that rock." And we looked and we said, "Well, it's not a rock, it's a bit of a plane." So we turned around and went back and had a look at this, and it was indeed a plane, a crashed plane. The fuselage was intact, but the engines had broken away and rolled across the glacier on impact. And it didn't take us long to find out there were 11 or 12 corpses on board. Well, we were rather stymied. We couldn't get across the glacier, and so we retreated to our base camp on Wiedemannsfjord, and we eventually were relieved there. And we had a radio, but we couldn't contact anybody with it. You never could. I mean, there were always these radio blackouts, and people weren't listening, or they weren't manning the channels and stuff. We never had much joy with radios in the old days. But it then turned out that when we were on our way back to England, we stopped off at the American Embassy in Reykjavik, and it happened to be a Sunday morning, and we knocked on the door, and some flunky came out, and we said, "We want to see the ambassador." He said, "You can't see the ambassador, it's Sunday morning." So we said, we want to report 12 dead American citizens. And he said, "Oh, well, that's different." So the ambassador came along and we told him all about it. And we said they're in a very awkward place on a glacier there, and we found them in the beginning of August. It's now the middle of September, and we don't think you'll be able to find them because the place will be covered with snow by now. We recommend that any expedition out there to retrieve the bodies that we put off until next summer. Well, imagine our surprise when we came back to Oxford. Come about November, we had a message from the American Embassy in London thanking us for our information and saying the US icebreaker Atka had been immediately directed to the site, and the bodies had been recovered and was returned to America, were in the Arlington National Cemetery. Well, never really thought more of that for a long time. Except we did get some letters from the family of the crew members also thanking us, because the plane, it had been originally in Spain and had been transferred to Keflavik, Iceland. It was a Neptune called. They used for identifying submarines. At this time, in the midst of the Cold War, the Denmark Strait and the Atlantic Ocean between Scotland and Iceland were the two routes by which the Russian Soviet nuclear submarines could escape from the Arctic Ocean into the Atlantic. And so they kept constant surveillance of these two sea lanes, and this Neptune, it was used for surveying the Denmark Strait. Well, the plane had gone down in, I think, 1962, and there'd been an intensive search with as many as 30 planes, I think, covering a huge area, and they continued the search for at least 14 days. It had gone down on the 12th of January. I happen to remember it's the 12th of January because that's my wife's birthday. And it had gone down in conditions where visibility was very poor, there was heavy snow, and its route had been to fly from Keflavik to sea area off the mouth of Scoresby, then turn east and make a triangular route back to Keflavik. We found the crash. It was far off its route to the west, and it had obviously flowed into the glacier, and we were informed that the radar they had on board would not show up the ice. So if they were flying over a glacier, they would see the bedrock, but they wouldn't see the ice. And the plane had flown into the ice and, been destroyed. It was in reasonably good condition when we found it, in the fact the fuselage was intact. The nose area was smashed, and the engines had torn off and rolled away, but the corpses were strapped into the seats. They were wearing survival suits and they were strapped into the seats. And it was all a bit spooky, really, to go in there and see these corpses sitting in their plane seats. Anyhow, at this time we never thought more of it, because the US Air Force had cleared it up, or the Navy had cleared it up, and there wasn't anything more to think about it. Well, in 1995, I was flying in that area over by the Lilloise intrusion. That was the one we couldn't reach because we couldn't cross the glacier. But now we're airborne, so there was no problem about that. And I said to the pilot, there used to be a plane crash over the other side of the glacier here, but I don't suppose anything to see now because we're told they'd recovered their bodies and removed the wreckage. Well, if there's one thing that pilots are fascinated by, it's aircraft crashes. You can't keep them away from an aircraft crash. And he said, well, let's go and have a look. So he zoomed across the glacier, and we flew in low, like 2 or 3 feet above the ice, and he said, there's plenty of wreckage around here still, and there was, yes. And he said, and there are body parts. I said, there can't be body parts. They took them back to the Arlington National Cemetery. Oh, yes, there's an arm and a leg over there. So we went and rooted around in he and the other pilot. They went there on several occasions, but we informed the police in Nuuk that we'd seen body parts on the glacier there, but we got a reply from them saying they didn't have resources to investigate the matter, so it remained as it was. And then a few years later, like 1997, I had a contact with a chap called Bob Petway in Kentucky, and he'd heard that I'd spotted body parts and parts of the plane on the glacier, and it turned out he'd been in this squadron when it was in Spain, and all these guys who died in the crash were his former colleagues. Since he came out of the Navy, he'd worked as a CIA agent. And he was very anxious to do something about this when he heard that body parts had been found of his former comrades, and he set up a petition group to get the Navy to go out and clear the place up and return the bodies for proper burial in the United States. Well, he had an uphill job there because they really weren't interested in spending all that money to have a trip to Greenland. But he mobilised public opinion, and I was rung up by the American ambassador in Copenhagen, invited to have lunch with him in the embassy, tell my version of it. And I was told that President Bush would be very interested in my comments. Anyhow, in the end this all succeeded, but it didn't work out until 2004. Although I'd found the thing again back in 1995, it took to 2004 to get a naval expedition mounted, where they went there with dogs and all kinds of things. I told there would be no problem. They should go, if they went in the middle of summer, there'd be no problem because there'd be bare ice at the site. But they had to spend millions of dollars on doing this. It had to be done, every contingent had to be taken care of, and they went with a whole lot of what they call cadaver dogs, because they said they might not be able to locate the cadavers. Anyhow, I guess the US Navy's got plenty of money once they thought they're going to spend it. So they recovered the bodies and returned them to the US, and there's a whole lot of stuff about where they were going to be buried, whether they were going to go into Arlington National Cemetery. They had a communal grave there, or whether they were going to return to their families for burial in their home place. Anyhow, by 2009, they had a ceremony in the Naval Air Force Base at Jacksonville in Florida, and they'd got another plane that was identical to the one that crashed, a sister plane to it, and they'd dressed it up in the number and everything of the crashed plane, and it's put on display there. They have a huge area where naval planes, Catalinas and all those sort of things are on display at the naval base in Jacksonville. And so I was invited to a ceremony there where they unveiled this exhibit and gave Bob Petway some kind of medal from the Navy. And then we were taken round and given a short flight on one of the planes that have replaced the Neptune now, the modern version of the plane. I was very touched by the captain's daughter called Patty. They lived on the Naval Air Force Base in Jacksonville, and she told me that she was 6 years old at the time, and she'd heard her daddy had disappeared and wouldn't be coming home. And they kept living on the Air Force Base for 6 months, and then she, her mother and little brother, they were kicked out and went to live in an apartment in Jacksonville town. And she was very upset about it because she said she looked out every morning to see if her daddy was coming up the path. He'd lost his plane, so he'd have to walk back, and she expected to see him any time. But they'd moved out of the Air Force Base now, and he wouldn't know where to go, wouldn't know where they were.
I'm Julie Hollis, and you've been listening to Polar Podcasts. In the next episode, we hear more from Emeritus Senior Scientist Niels Henriksen about the first geological survey mapping campaign in East Greenland in the late 1960s.